Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. I've got something unusual for Tales Told this time. It's science fiction, but it's creepy science fiction. Think of the film Alien. Is it a monster movie? Yep. Is it set in outer space? Yep. Is it horror or science fiction? Yep. I'm going to read you something from a magazine serial called Stories of Other Worlds. It was published in 1900 and written by George Griffith. A year later, it was published in book form, but the title became A Honeymoon in Space. Those two titles, Stories of Other Worlds and A Honeymoon in Space, give you a pretty good idea of the general plot. Each magazine installment or book chapter is its own independent story. For instance, in the first chapter, the characters travel to the moon. The second chapter is a voyage to Mars, etc., etc. Now, this is all possible because of the work of a man named Hartley Rennick. He's a professor who discovered what he calls the R force, or the repulsive force. It's the opposite of gravity. And with this knowledge, he's able to construct a spaceship called the Astronef. Professor Rennick's work is funded by a wealthy Englishman with the impressive name of Rollo Lennox Smeaton Aubrey, Earl of Redgrave. Lord Redgrave falls in love with the professor's daughter, Zadie. They get married, and they're the ones who go on the honeymoon in space. Now, there's one other character, Andrew Murgatroyd. He's kind of the space butler, you might call him. He knows how to pilot the ship, he takes care of the ship, but his primary function seems to be to worry about the newlyweds, because they're the ones who leave the Astronef to go exploring these various planets. Now, I'll be reading you a segment from the first installment, A Visit to the Moon, which might sound like a very romantic idea. Let's go to the moon for our honeymoon. But nope. They passed out of the Astronef through an airtight chamber in the wall of her lowest compartment, Murgatroyd closing the first door behind them. Redgrave opened the next one and dropped a short ladder onto the gray, loose, sand-strewn rock of the little plane on which they had stopped. Then he stood aside and motioned for Zadie to go down first. She understood him and, taking his hand, descended the 4 easy steps, and so hers was the first human foot which, in all the ages since its creation, had rested on the surface of the world that had been. Redgrave followed her with a little spring which landed him gently beside her. Then he took both her hands and pressed them hard in his. He would have kissed her if he could, but of course that was out of the question. Then he connected the telephone wire, and hand in hand they crossed the little plateau toward the edge of the tremendous gulf, 54 miles across and nearly 20,000 feet deep. In the middle of it rose a conical mountain about 5,000 feet high, the summit of which was just beginning to catch the solar rays. Half of the vast plain was already brilliantly illuminated, but round the central cone was a vast semicircle of shadow, impenetrable in its blackness. "Day and night in this same valley, actually side by side," said Zadie. Then she stopped and pointed down into the brightly lit distance. She went on hurriedly. "Look, Lennox, look at the foot of the mountain there. Doesn't that seem like the ruins of a city?"
"It does,"
he said.
"and there's no reason why it shouldn't be. I've always thought that, as the air and water disappeared from the upper parts of the moon, the inhabitants, whoever they were, must have been driven down into the deeper parts. Shall we go down and see?" "But how?" she said. He pointed toward the Astronef. She nodded her helmeted head, and they went back to the vessel. A few minutes later, the vessel had risen from her resting place with a spring which rapidly carried her over half of the vast crater, and then she began to drop slowly into the depths. She grounded as gently as before, and presently they were standing on the lunar surface about a mile from the central cone. This time, however, Redgrave had taken the precaution to bring a magazine rifle and a couple of revolvers with him in case any strange monsters, relics of the vanished fauna of the moon, might still be taking refuge in these mysterious depths.
Although Zadie, like a good many American girls, could shoot excellently well, she carried no weapon more offensive than a whole-plate camera in a tripod, which here, of course, only weighed a sixth of their earthly weight. The first thing that Redgrave did when they stepped onto the sandy surface of the plain was to stoop down and strike a wax match. There was a tiny glimmer of light, which was immediately extinguished.
"No air here,"
he said,
"so we shall find no living beings. At any rate, none like ourselves."
They found the walking exceedingly easy, although their boots were purposely weighted in order to counteract to some extent the great difference in gravity. A few minutes' sharp walking brought them to the outskirts of the city. It had no walls, and in fact exhibited no signs of preparation for defense. Its streets were broad and well paved. The houses, built of great blocks of gray stone joined together with white cement, looked as fresh and unworn as though they had only been built a few months earlier, whereas they had probably stood for hundreds of thousands of years. They were flat-roofed, all of one story, and practically of one type. There were very few public buildings, and absolutely no attempt at ornamentation was visible. Round some of the houses were spaces which might once have been gardens. In the midst of the city, which appeared to cover an area of about 4 square miles, was an enormous square paved with flagstones, which were covered to the depth of a couple of inches with a light gray dust. As they walked across it, this remained perfectly still, save for the disturbance caused by their footsteps. There was no air to support it, otherwise it might have risen in clouds about them. From the center of this square rose a huge pyramid, nearly 1,000 feet in height, the sole building in the great silent city, which appeared to have been raised as a monument or possibly a temple by the hands of its vanished inhabitants. As they approached this, they saw a curious white fringe lying round the steps by which it was approached. When they got nearer, they found that this fringe was composed of millions of white bleached bones and skulls, shaped very much like those of terrestrial men, save that they were much larger and that the ribs were out of all proportion to the rest of the bones. They stopped awe-stricken before this strange spectacle. Redgrave stooped down and took hold of one of the bones, a huge thigh bone. It broke in two as he tried to lift it, and the pieces which remained in his hand crumbled instantly to white powder.
"Whoever they were,"
said Redgrave,
"they were giants. When air and water failed above, they came down here by some means and built this city. You see what enormous chests they must have had? That would be nature's last struggle to enable them to breathe the diminishing atmosphere. These, of course, will be the last descendants of the fittest to breathe it. This was their temple, I suppose, and here they came to die, I wonder how many thousand years ago, perishing of heat and cold and hunger and thirst. The last tragedy of the race, which, after all, must have been something like our own." "It is just too awful for words," said Zadie. "Shall we go into the temple? That seems one of the entrances up there, only I don't like walking over all these bones." Her voice sounded very strange over the wire which connected their helmets. "I don't suppose they'd mind if we do," replied Redgrave. "Only we mustn't go in too far. It may be full of cross passages and mazes, and we might never get out. Our lamps won't be much use in there, you know, for there's no air. There'll just be points of light, and we shan't see anything but them. It's very aggravating, but I'm afraid there's no help for it. Come along." They ascended the steps, crushing the bones and skulls to powder beneath their feet, and entered the huge square doorway, which looked like a rectangle of blackness against the gray-white of the wall. Even through their asbestos-woven clothing, they felt a sudden shock of icy cold. In those few steps they had passed from a temperature of tenfold summer heat into one far below that of the coldest spots on earth. They turned on the electric lamps which were fitted to the breastplates of their dresses, but they could see nothing save the glow of the lamps. All about them was darkness impenetrable, and so they reluctantly turned back to the doorway, leaving all the mysteries which the vast temple might contain to remain mysteries to the end of time.
They passed down the steps again and crossed the square, and for the next half hour Zaidi, who was photographer to the expedition, was busy taking photographs of the pyramid with its ghastly surroundings and a few general views of this strange city of the dead. Then they went back to the Astronef. They found Murgatroyd pacing up and down under the dome, looking about him with serious eyes, yet betraying no particular curiosity. The wonderful vessel was at once his home and his idol, and nothing but the direct orders of his master would have induced him to leave her, even in a world in which there was probably not a living human being to dispute possession of her. When they had resumed their ordinary clothing, she rose rapidly from the surface of the plain, crossed the encircling wall at the height of a few hundred feet, and made her way at a speed of about 50 miles an hour toward the regions of the South Pole. Behind them to the northwest they could see from their elevation of nearly 30,000 feet the vast expanse of the Sea of Clouds. Dotted here and there were the shining points and ridges of light, marking the peaks and crater walls which the rays of the rising sun had already touched. Before them and to the right and left of them rose a vast maze of crater rings and huge ramparts of mountain walls, enclosing plains so far below their summits that the light of neither sun nor earth ever reached them. By directing the force exerted by what now might be called the propelling part of the engines against the mountain masses, which they crossed to right and left and behind, Redgrave was able to take a zigzag course which carried him over many of the walled plains, which were wholly or partially lit up by the sun, and in nearly all of the deepest their telescopes revealed what they had found within the crater of Tycho. At length, pointing to a gigantic circle of white light fringing an abyss of utter darkness, he said, "There is Newton, the greatest mystery of the moon. Those inner walls are 24,000 feet high. That means that the bottom, which has never been seen by human eyes, is about 5,000 feet below the surface of the moon. What do you say, dear? Shall we go down and see if the searchlight will show us anything? There may be air there." "Certainly," replied Zaidi decisively. "Haven't we come to see things that nobody else has ever seen?" Redgrave signaled to the engine room, and presently the Astronef changed her course, and in a few minutes was hanging bathed in sunlight, like a star suspended over the unfathomable gulf of darkness below. As they sank beyond the sunlight, Murgatroyd turned on both the head and stern searchlights. They dropped down ever slowly, and more slowly, until gradually the two long, thin streams of light began to spread themselves out, and by the time the Astronef came gently to a rest, they were swinging round her in broad fans of diffuse light over a dark, marshy surface, with scattered patches of moss and reeds, which showed dull gleams of stagnant water between them. "Air and water at last," said Redgrave as he rejoined his wife on the upper deck. "Air and water and eternal darkness. Well, we shall find life on the moon here, if anywhere. Shall we go?" "Of course," replied her ladyship. "What else have we come for? Must we put on the breathing dresses?" "Certainly," he replied. "Although there's air, we don't know yet whether it is breathable. It may be half carbon dioxide for all we know. A few matches will soon tell us that." Within a quarter of an hour they were again standing on the surface. Murgatroyd had orders to follow them as far as possible with the head searchlight, which, in the comparatively rarefied atmosphere, appeared to have a range of several miles. Redgrave struck a match and held it up level with his head. It burnt with a clear, steady yellow flame.
"Where a match will burn, a man can breathe," he said. "I'm going to see what lunar air is like." "For heaven's sake, be careful, dear,"
came the reply in pleading tones across the wire.
"All right, but don't open your helmet till I tell you."
He then raised the hermetically closed slide of glass which formed the front of the helmets half an inch or so. Instantly he felt a sensation like the drawing of a red-hot iron across his skin. He snapped the visor down and clasped it in its place. For a moment or two he gasped for breath, and then he said rather faintly,
"It's no good. It's too cold. It would freeze the blood in our veins. I think we'd better go back and explore this valley under cover. We can't do anything in the dark, and we can see just as well from the upper deck with the searchlights. Besides, as there's air and water here, there's no telling, but there may be inhabitants of sorts such as we shouldn't care to meet.
He took her hand, and to Murgatroyd's intense relief, they went back to the vessel. Redgrave then raised the Astronef a couple of 100 feet, and by directing the repulsive force against the mountain walls, developed just sufficient energy to keep them moving at about 12 miles an hour. They began to cross the plain with their searchlights flashing out in all directions. They had scarcely gone a mile before the headlight fell upon a moving form, half walking, half crawling, along some stunted, brown-leaved bushes by the side of a broad, stagnant stream. "Look," said Zadie, clasping her husband's arm. "Is that a gorilla or... No, it can't be a man." The light was turned full upon the object. If it had been covered with hair, it might have passed for some strange type of the ape tribe, but its skin was smooth and of a livid gray. Its lower limbs were evidently more powerful than its upper. Its chest was enormously developed, but the stomach was small. The head was big and round and smooth. As they came nearer, they saw that, in place of fingernails, it had long white feelers, which it kept extended and constantly waving about as it groped its way toward the water. As the intense light flashed full on it, it turned its head towards them. It had a nose and a mouth. The nose was long and thick with huge mobile nostrils, and the mouth formed an angle, something like a fish's lips. Of teeth, there were none. At either side of the upper part of the nose, there were two little sunken holes in which this thing's ancestors of countless thousand years ago had possessed eyes. As she looked upon this awful parody of what had once, perhaps, been a human face, Zadie covered her eyes with her hands and uttered a little moan of horror.
"Horrible, isn't it?" said Redgrave. "I suppose that's what the last remnants of the Lunarians have come to. Evidently once men and women something like ourselves. I dare say the ancestors of that thing had lived here in coldness and darkness for hundreds of generations. Shows how tremendously tenacious nature is of life. Ages ago, that awful thing's ancestors lived up yonder when there were seas and rivers, fields and forests, just like we have them on Earth. Men and women who could see and breathe and enjoy everything in life, and had built up civilizations like ours. Look, it's going to fish or something. Now we shall see what it feeds on. I wonder why that water isn't frozen. I suppose there must be some internal heat left still, split up into patches, I dare say, in lakes of lava. Perhaps this valley is just over one of them, and that's why these creatures have managed to survive. Ah, there's another of them, smaller, not so strongly formed. That thing's mate, I suppose, female of the species. I wonder how many hundreds of thousands of years it'll take for our descendants to come to that.
I hope our dear old Earth will hit something and be smashed to atoms before that happens," exclaimed Zadie, whose curiosity had now partly overcome her horror. "Look, it's trying to catch something." The larger of the two creatures had groped its way to the edge of the sluggish, half-fetid water and dropped, or rather rolled, quietly into it. It was evidently cold-blooded, or nearly so, for no warm-blooded animal could have withstood that more than glacial cold. Presently the other dropped in too, and both disappeared for some minutes. Then suddenly there was a violent commotion in the water a few yards away. The two creatures rose to the surface of the water, one with a wriggling eel-like fish between its jaws. They both groped their way toward the edge. They had just reached it and were pulling themselves out when a hideous shape rose out of the water behind them. It was like the head of an octopus joined to the body of a boa constrictor, but head and neck were both of the same ghastly, livid gray as the other two bodies. It was evidently blind too, for it took no notice of the brilliant glare of the searchlight. Still, it moved rapidly toward the two scrambling forms, its long white feelers trembling out in all directions. Then one of them touched the smaller of the two creatures. Instantly the rest shot out and closed round it, and with scarcely a struggle it was dragged beneath the water and vanished. Zadie uttered a little low scream and covered her face again, and Redgrave said, "Same old brutal law again. Life preying upon life, even on a dying world. A world that is more than half dead itself. Well, I think we've seen enough of this place. I suppose those are about the only types of life we should meet anywhere, and one acquaintance with them satisfies me completely. I vote we go and see what the Invisible Hemisphere is like." "I have had all I want of this side," said Zadie, looking away from the scene of the hideous conflict, "so the sooner the better." A few minutes later the Astronef was again rising toward the stars, with her searchlight still flashing down into the valley of expiring life, which seemed worse than the valley of death. As he followed the rays with a pair of powerful field glasses, Redgrave fancied that he saw huge dim shapes moving about the stunted shrubbery and through the slimy pools of the stagnant rivers. Once or twice he got a glimpse of what might well have been the ruins of towns and cities, but the gloom soon became too deep and dense for the searchlight to pierce. He was glad when the Astronef soared up into the brilliant sunlight once more. Even the ghastly wilderness of the lunar landscape was welcome after the nameless horrors of that hideous abyss. After a couple of hours' rapid traveling, Redgrave pointed down to a comparatively small, deep crater and said, "There, that is Malapert. It is almost exactly at the south pole of the moon, and there," he went on, pointing ahead, "is the horizon of the hemisphere which no earth-born eyes but ours and Murgatroyd's have ever seen." Contrary to certain ingenious speculations which have been indulged in, they found that the hemisphere, which for countless ages had never been turned toward the earth, was almost an exact replica of the visible one. Fully 3/4 of it was brilliantly illuminated by the sun, and the scene which presented itself to their eyes was practically the same which they had beheld on the earthward side. Huge groups of enormous craters and ringed mountains, long, irregular chains crowned with sharp, splintery peaks, and between these, vast, deeply depressed areas ranging in color from dazzling white to gray-brown, marking the beds of the vanished lunar seas. As they crossed one of these, Redgrave allowed the Astronef to sink to within a few thousand feet of the surface, and then he and Zadie swept it with their telescopes. Their chance search was rewarded by what they had not seen in the seabeds of the other hemisphere. These depressions were far deeper than the others, evidently many thousands of feet deep, but the sun's rays were blazing full into this one, and dotted round its slopes at varying elevations they made out little patches which seemed to differ from the general surface. "I wonder if those are the remains of cities," said Zadie. "Isn't it possible that the populations might have built their cities along the seas, and that their descendants may have followed the waters as they retreated? I mean, as they either dried up or disappeared into the center?" "Very probable, my dear," he said. "We'll go down and see." He diminished the vertically repulsive force a little, and the Astronef dropped slantingly toward the bed of what might once have been called the Pacific of the Moon. When they were in about a couple of thousand feet of the surface, it became quite plain that Zadie was correct in her hypothesis. The vast seafloor was literally strewn with the ruins of countless cities and towns, which had been inhabited by an equally countless series of generations of men and women who had, perhaps, lived in the days when our own world was a glowing mass of molten rock, surrounded by the envelope of vapors, which has since condensed to form its oceans. The nearer they approached the central and deepest depression, the more perfect the buildings became, until down in the lowest depth they found a collection of low-built square edifices, scarcely better than huts, which had clustered round the little lake into which ages before the ocean had dwindled. But where the lake had been, there was now only a depression covered with gray sand and brown rock. Into this they descended and touched the lunar soil for the last time. A couple of hours' excursion along the houses proved that they had been the last refuge of the last descendants of a dying race, a race which had steadily degenerated, just as the successions of cities had done, as the bitter fight for mere existence had become keener and keener until the last two essentials, air and water, had failed, and then the end had come. The streets, like the square of the great temple in Tycho, were strewn with myriads and myriads of bones, and there were myriads more scattered round what had once been the shores of the dwindling lake. Here, as elsewhere, there was not a sign or a record of any kind, neither carving nor sculpture. Inside the great pyramid of the city of Tycho, they might perhaps have found something, some stone or tablet which bore the mark of the artist's hand. Elsewhere, perhaps, they might have found cities reared by older races, which might have rivaled the creations of Egypt and Babylon. But there was no time to look for these. All that they had seen of the dead world had only sickened and saddened them. The untraveled regions of space, peopled by living worlds more akin to their own, were before them, and the red disk of Mars was glowing in the zenith among the diamond-white clusters which gemmed the black sky behind them. More than 100 millions of miles had to be traversed before they would be able to set foot on this surface, and so after one last look round the valley of death about them, Redgrave turned on the full energy of the repulsive force in a vertical direction, and the Astronef leapt forward in a straight line for her new destination. The unknown hemisphere spread out in a vast plain beneath them. The blazing sun rose on their left, and the brilliant silver orb of the earth on their right. And, full of wonder and yet without regret, they bade farewell to the world that was. Well, I certainly hope that the honeymoon gets better on Mars. As you were listening to this, did you think at all about H.G. Wells's novel, The First Men in the Moon? That came out in 1900, which is the very same year as the magazine version of Stories of Other Worlds. So I don't think that Griffith was stealing from Wells or Wells was stealing from Griffith. I think they were just working on the same basic idea at the same time. Maybe there's a little bit of influence on Griffith from Wells's novel, The Time Machine, which came out 5 years earlier. Nonetheless, I thought Griffith's story was interesting enough to include in an anthology titled Imagining Life on the Moon During the Rise of the Telescope. Now, speculation about life on the moon goes way, way back to ancient Greece and Rome. But in the 1600s, telescopes began to be developed, and that kind of jump-started the debates over life on the moon. At the same time, it gave fiction writers a chance to really let themselves go and have a lot of fun with imagining what lunar life might be like. Some of the stories in the anthology get pretty wacky, much funnier than what we heard today. Debates about the possibility of life on the moon, those continued through the 1700s and into the early 1800s, and that's when writers like Washington Irving and Edgar Allan Poe played around with that tradition of fiction about lunar life, and they show up in the anthology too. By the late 1800s, telescopes had developed enough that the general consensus became, no, there is no life on the moon, but that didn't stop fiction writers. If you'd like to find out more about this anthology, visit brombonesbooks.com. There's a timeline there that I put together that traces the long history of scientific speculation about life on the moon, but also some of the key works of fiction. Once again, brombonesbooks.com. It's an especially interesting topic given that NASA's Artemis program is going to take us back to the moon. Who knows what we'll find? I'm Tim Prossel. Thank you very much for listening.